Welcome to the Ben Wood Johnson podcast. You can visit Dr. Johnson's blog at benwoodpost.com. Dr. Johnson's works can be found at drbenwoodjohnson.com. You can also support Dr. Johnson on Patreon, the link to which is in the description. Hey, welcome to the Ben Wood Johnson podcast. One more time, this is Dr. Ben Wood Johnson here. Today is October the 5th, 2020. This is podcast number 55. Welcome one more time. I'm happy to have you back for one more season, one more episode about philosophy. Today we are going to talk about freedom. Now, this is a part of a series of podcasts which I will publish in sequence, of course, over the next few weeks about the notion of freedom. What does it mean? What does it mean to be free, and what does it mean not to be free? Of course, I will argue that we are not free, but I will provide explanations as to how, at least explanations to support why I think we are not free, and why we will never be free, and why the notion itself, it's a feel-good way of looking at our world, looking at our reality. We are, in fact, in prison. It is a mental prison. It is a bondage that we were born into, and we will always be that way. So, as usual, without further ado, let us delve right into it. What is freedom? Better yet, do you consider yourself free? Are you a free entity? Are you free to exist to the extent that you want to exist? Are you free to be a certain way to the extent that others might want you to be a certain way? Do you have the freedom to be however, whenever you might want to be? Now, these are fundamental questions which I could not answer objectively. The reason I am saying that I could not answer those questions objectively, it is because there is not a universal way of looking at how a person thinks or should think at a certain point in time. Therefore, it is almost impossible, or virtually impossible, to talk on behalf of others. I could talk about myself to the extent that I understand myself. I could talk about the way I understand myself. I could certainly make inferences about what I think about myself, what I know, or perhaps believe myself to be. Which does not necessarily mean that whatever I say about myself is exactly or is in fact what myself is at a particular moment in time. Rather, it is a snapshot of what I think of myself at a particular moment in time. But let's go back to our original questions, or perhaps the most important of it all. What is freedom? When you say that so-and-so is free, what do you mean? Or what do they mean when they say that so-and-so is free? Is there a way we could understand freedom to the extent that we could sort of assign a certain tangibility to the concept, where we could say, not necessarily in the abstract, but in the real, in a tangible sense, freedom is this, that, or that? Well, the answer is perhaps not. But before we get into at least my understanding of what freedom is, let me say a couple of things. First of all, I have just released a book about freedom. It's called Discourse on Human Freedom. It is available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and whatnot. This book sort of talks about fallacies, misunderstandings, erroneous assumptions that we hold about freedom. It delves into the concept as to what is freedom to the extent that we could perceive freedom to be a certain way. It gives practical examples as to why freedom is almost impossible in a world of constraint, because we live in a world of constraint. Everything that we are is based on a constraint or on restrictions. So freedom is almost impossible to exist in that context. So the book sort of goes in detail as to what freedom is. I strongly recommend that you pick up a copy if you want to learn more about my understanding of freedom. Now, keep in mind that the book itself is mostly philosophical. Of course, the term freedom itself it's an abstract concept which could only be understood from a philosophical lens. But the book itself, sort of delves into that philosophical realm where it talks about freedom in terms of, how, I perceive it to be, or perhaps how it should be perceived, considering the realities we live in societies. But the book talks about freedom in terms of its implications in society, and it mentions the recent debacles about the COVID-19. People are being told how to be, when to be, and to the extent that they might not have wanted to be that way, to the extent that the collective has a certain power over the individual when it comes to freedom. All of that I talk about in the book. If you feel like you'd like to learn more about freedom, grab a copy of this book. It delves in detail some of these notions. It also gives you some examples as far as immigrations, because sometimes people are constrained in a society, in a social environment, because of their immigration status and whatnot, and that also impedes their understanding of their freedom at a certain time, at a certain point in time. Anyway, so that's out of the way. Now, what is freedom? Now, let's look at some definitions that are somewhat common. Definitions that most people would sort of refer to when they're talking about freedom. Whenever we're talking about freedom, the understanding is that freedom is a state of not being enslaved. If you're not in prison, you are free. Okay. It's the understanding that freedom is the power to be, the power to act, the power to think, the power to speak, the power to be a certain way without any restraint or constraint or without any hindrance. And that understanding is based on the assumptions that there could be no restraint, there could be no control, there could be no hindrance. And when that is in fact the case, then you are free. Now, I think this is a fallacy to the extent that you could not talk about freedom from the perspective of a person who is part of a collective entity, which is society. You could look at freedom from two angles. That is, we could examine the concept from two angles. We could examine the concept from a natural standpoint, and we could examine it from a societal standpoint. But in either case, you cannot be free. There is no freedom to be had. So, let's talk about freedom from a natural standpoint. What is freedom in nature? Are you free to the extent that you are not wired with the natural? To what degree can you be outside of your nature or outside of the natural itself? Could you wake up one day and, well, first of all, could you wake up just because you wanted to wake up, or could you not wake up because you sort of didn't want to wake up? Are there things in you as a person that you could at any moment decide to forego? For example, could you forego to eat? Could you forego to sleep? Could you forego to walk? Could you forego to talk? Could you forego to open your eyes? Could you forego to sort of listen? Could you forego to stop thinking? Are there things about you as a person in your nature that you could decide, I am not going to do, and you have the power, the free will to sort of say, I am not going to do this? Now, if the answer is yes, that means you don't understand what freedom is, at least from a natural standpoint. You see, in nature, every entity is supposed to be a certain way. And that supposition, or that obligation, to put it this way, is natural to the extent that the being has absolutely no say whatsoever as to why he is, when he is, or how he is. So to that extent, the being could not claim any freedom because his nature is constrained within the boundaries of what his nature would allow him to do, to be, or to exist, or to the extent that his nature would allow him to exist. For example, you could not forego your natural need to feed yourself. It is not a personal decision to say, I am going to eat or I am not going to eat. Yes, to some extent, you could postpone that need to the extent that you could supplement that need by some other things, some other realities. But at some point, you will have to eat. You could not forego not going to bed, not to sleep. At some point, you will have to sleep because your nature will kick in. And once your nature kicks in, you have absolutely no power other than to succumb to that nature. So everything in your nature, in your body, is based on the nature of your body itself. In other words, you cannot forego anything that is part of you. You could, to some extent, postpone that. You could sort of say, okay, I am not going to do this at this moment. I am not going to do that at that particular moment. And as long as, the nature would allow you to postpone it, you will be able to do that. But you will not be able to forego that. So to that extent, you cannot, in and of yourself, decide not to do a certain way. So whatever you do is always going to be incumbent upon what your nature will allow you to do. So to that extent, freedom from a natural standpoint, it's a fallacy. You could claim to be free. You could claim that it's your body. You could claim that it's you. You get to decide. You get to be however you want. But the reality always brings you back to earth to the extent that you always face your nature, which is not within your purview. You can only be to the extent that your nature would allow you to be. And there's no way around that reality. So what we have to understand here is that every time we are talking about being free in nature, we're talking about a fallacy. Because being free in nature means that you get to be outside nature. You get to decide things, you get to be a certain way, and your nature has absolutely no power over you. It's like you're an alien. The rules of the natural do not apply to you. For instance, even if you're not a bird, you can fly. Even if you're not a fish, you can swim. You can stay underwater for a long period. You can sort of live underwater, right? Even if you are not anything that your nature does not allow your body to do, to endure, you are able to sort of go through that experience at ease, at will, and without any precaution. Okay? So to that extent, you wouldn't be constrained, you wouldn't be restrained. Now, in fact, we know that is not the case, okay? Everything we do is incumbent upon anything our nature allows us to do. To the extent that nature allows us to be a certain way, then we can be that way. And if our nature does not allow us to be that way, we could not be that way. And that is the reality of our beingness in the natural. We could only be to the extent that our nature would allow us to be. So from that perspective, you cannot be free. You are not free in nature. Of course, we're going to come back to this idea a little later because we're going to talk further about freedom in terms of, the philosophical underpinnings of the concept. But for today, let us leave it at that. To that extent, you are not free from your natural standpoint. From a natural standpoint, you are not free. The other aspect about freedom is the concept of freedom in society, and is when you look at freedom from a societal standpoint. We're going to talk in detail about this concept, but for now, let us look at freedom from this lens. What is freedom in society? Now, first of all, we have to understand what society is. Okay, society is an entity whereby two or more entities exist together. And because you have two or more entities that exist together, there's a conflict between what the entity itself wants or needs, or in what the collective wants or needs. The balance between what the entity wants or needs and what the collective wants or needs could be understood as freedom or the lack thereof. For instance, I was born out of a family of two. We've talked about that. You could refer back to my other podcast where I talk about individual and the collective. So if you want to understand what I'm saying here a little more in depth, but the idea here is that every individual is only an individual to the extent that he is part of a collective. So his individual identity is based on his collective identity. You could not be an entity in and of itself so long as you come from a collective. In this case, I'm talking about a collective of two, a collective of mom and dad. So, in either way, you have to be a part of something. So to that extent, your individuality is relative to the collective in which you come from, in which you evolve at a certain point in time. So society is based on the notion that individuals form collectives, and those collectives in turn form an entity which we consider, at least which we label as society. For example, a family of three is a collective of three. But one family with another family and another family constitute a society, because you have a collection of families in which, there are certain mode or modalities of existence within that society. For example, family A may have a way may have its own customs, traditions, and whatnot. Family B may have its own customs, traditions, and whatnot. Family C could have the same. But when we live as a society, as a collective of collectives, then we have one common identity, and that common identity is generally based on the rules, the traditions, customs that we espoused as a collective. Even though we have our own collective identities, but we have a collective identity within this whole set of collectives, which in this case is society as a whole. So right off the bat, you can see that the individual is less and less important in relation to the collective. Like in the first collective, let's say between mom and dad, that individual had a certain identity, which is a natural identity. For instance, he was born a particular way. That particular way might be or could be construed as the individual identity or the individual's identity at that point. And not to be politically correct here, but let us say that the person was born a male, okay? As this person is born a male, that person automatically takes the identity of a male. And that identity creates a sense of individuality within the collective of three. For instance, mom is going to be a female, and dad is going to be a male, and that individual who was born biologically, of course, within that collective is going to have his own identity, whether that individual is a male or the individual is a female. Okay, so that individual is going to garner, or at least earn, his own identity within that collective, right? Now, as he is a male within this collective of three, that individual's identity is only relevant to the extent that mom and dad allow the individual to retain his identity. Okay? So, and as the individual evolves into a group of collectives, like the individual starts going to school, the individual starts mingling with other individuals, start understanding himself in relation to others within the collectives in which he or she evolves, that individual is finding out less about his identity, his original identity. Okay? For instance, the person might think that he is a male, and as he evolves in a society, he finds out, well, maybe I'm not a male, okay? Or maybe I'm not supposed to be that way. Or maybe I should be a male this way, or I should be a female that way, and so on and so forth. Again, this is not to be politically correct, and I know society these days, we have individuals who have different understandings as to their gender and whatnot, and again, this conversation is not to be politically correct. But bear in mind that what I am talking about here, I am talking about the biology of being a person, okay? I'm not talking about the societal understanding of what being a person is or what personhood is, okay? But within the context of society itself. So in society, traditions, norms, and whatnot sort of dictate who we are in terms of who we think we are, okay? So within that little constraint, you can see how freedom might be a problem. Because if you grew up in an environment where your understanding of yourself is a certain way, and you are being told by the societal milieu itself that you are this and you should be conformed yourself to that particular role, then it might constrain, at least give you a certain restriction as to what you think about your freedom is. But from a societal standpoint, freedom is relative to the degree to which society itself would allow you to enjoy something that is not necessarily freedom, but something, some state of being that sort of gives you a sense that you are free. Well, the problem is that this is seldom the case, because society, at least the collective milieu we call our society, usually has its own understanding as to what things are, where things should be, or who people are, who people should be. And to that extent, being free means you would have to be yourself within the collective, despite the collective, to put it this way. And this is almost impossible because you have to reflect what society expects from you, what the collective expects from you, and failure of you to be that way could ultimately lead to your demise, or perhaps to your incarceration, or maybe you could be ostracized in the social milieu itself. So you would have to conform to the expectations of the social milieu. So to that extent, whenever we're talking about freedom, we have to take into account those constraints that are inherent within those environments. Whether you were born a particular way, and that is, we're looking at freedom from a natural standpoint, there are natural constraints that are sort of determine how you are going to be, and you could not do away with them. You could not forego those natural constraints. All the same, within the context of society, there are some societal norms, pre-established norms, in which you had absolutely no say as to how they came about. You had absolutely no say as to why they exist, and should they continue to exist. Yet you are expected to abide by those norms, and failure of you to do so could lead to could have consequences which you might not have foreseen had you not pay attention to the environment in which you evolved. So basically, whenever we're talking about freedom, we have to take into account those those two differences, whether we're talking about freedom from a societal standpoint or whether we're talking about freedom from a natural standpoint, simply does not exist. To that extent, you are not free, or you could never be free. Okay, so those are the sort of the ramifications of the concept of freedom, in which we are going to talk a little bit more in the next few podcasts. So freedom, to that extent, is just a fallacy, and you have to understand that. And perhaps in understanding that freedom is a fallacy, you could have a sense of freedom to the extent that you could sort of be a certain way, not necessarily to sort of put yourself in a situation to lose any sense of freedom that you might have at any given point in time.